We are live.
Yay!
Hey everyone.
Hello.
So I'm going to do a quick intro to the panel. So I'm Maize. My pronouns are they, them, and we're going to be talking about a project that VMDO have set up, pairing up indie bands and indie developers. But first, I'm going to do an acknowledgement of country. We meet here on the lands of the Bunurong and Wurundjeri people, and I'd like to acknowledge their elders past and present, and also the elders past and present of all of the lands that our viewers are on. I want to acknowledge that the land that we're on was never ceded. It always will and always was Aboriginal land, and once we engage in truth telling, we can add our history to the 60,000 years plus here before us and move together united. And I want to talk about Black Lives Matter and bring it back to here, where Indigenous deaths in custody and incarceration are way higher than the rest of the population. And just have a moment's silence to think about these injustices and the deaths that happen here on colonized land. All right, thanks. So we'll go around our panel and we'll do a quick introduction of everyone. So I'll go first. My name's Maize. My pronouns are they, them. I work in game audio in Melbourne and around the world, working remotely and traveling. I also teach game audio and video game production, and do advocacy for workers as part of Game Workers Unite and non-binary people as part of Non-Binary Zone and Making Space. Cecile, would you like to go next?
Yeah. My name's Cecile Richard, and my pronouns are they, them, and I'm a graphic designer. Like my main job is that, but like I also make small personal games on Bitsy and maybe other things in the future. And my personal work usually kind of like revolves around like subjects, like themes, like connection and belonging, which is a theme for the festival this year, and like that sort of like memory stuff. Yeah, that's it.
Nick, would you like to go next?
Yeah, hi. My name's Nick. My pronouns are he, him. I play in a band called Cable Ties, who are currently participating in one of the VMDO's programs, which is why I'm here. I'm also a radio broadcaster. I've spent about 5 years at PBS FM, and I'm now a fill-in broadcaster over at 3RRR in Brunswick East. And I also work in music booking for bands, and I book for a small venue in Melbourne, and I also put on events and small festivals.
And Bonnie.
Hi, my name's Bonnie Dalton. My pronouns are she, her. I am currently in dual roles as the part-time general manager of the Victorian Music Development Office, and also the music industry liaison for Creative Victoria. And yeah, I'm just really thrilled to be here, really excited about the program that we'll be talking about, and thanks for having me.
Thanks so much. So this program we've put together is pairing Cecile with Cable Ties to make a game with one of Cable Ties' already released tracks. And we're looking at, how can developers work with local indie bands, and how is that different to sync music, where you might go to a library or something like that, or working with a composer? And so, Bonnie, why does VMDO care about this? Like, what is I think for games in Melbourne and Victoria, we're quite used to. Film Victoria gives out grants, but otherwise we're pretty ignored. So what is this?
Well, I mean, I think this came about through we did some work last year as part of Melbourne International Games Week, and I was really conscious of the focus of a lot of that was around composers, and obviously a really important part of music in games being that composer side. But I felt like there was a missing conversation there that was coming from anything that we could help to facilitate. And when I was in LA in August, I met a woman called Cecile, who is the head of sync for EA Games. And I happened to be with Katie Besgrove, who is one of the managers of Courtney Barnett, and she and Cecile realised that they'd actually worked together because one of Courtney's tracks was on a FIFA game, and just had this whole conversation. And I thought about that in the context of Melbourne and the fact that there were lots of synergies between the way that indie music and indie games kind of work, and having already met you, Maize, the conversation had sort of started in terms of what else we could potentially do, and it just kind of flowed from there. I think this idea that there are people making games and there are people making music, and even not necessarily knowing what exactly the outcome of this project will be, but just feeling like these are two communities that actually have a lot in common, and it would be a really nice idea to get them together in some way and sort of see what happens. So it's not necessarily, I mean, obviously from the music development side, it would be great if this could become another pathway for audience development and income streams and all of those things for music. But it's also, I guess, about not necessarily understanding the space well enough to prescribe an outcome like that, but feeling like there's a conversation that would be nice to help facilitate and see what happens between these two creative communities.
Yeah, I'd like Cecile and Nick, when you were approached with, hey, you're an indie X, do you want to work with an indie Y? What were your reactions? Were you like, oh yeah, that makes total sense? Or were you like, why? Or, what were you thinking?
For me, I was like, hell yeah. Because like so much of my approach in making games, because I went into making games through it was kind of like a coincidence where like I used to make, well, I kind of still make comics and zines and stuff, and that culture already has like a lot of that DIY, indie feeling, and I just kind of like transposed that attitude in like games, and like I think particularly like what I make, like the Bitsy community itself is also very similar to that. Like it's very like, lots of people in there, like, people who make zines, or like people who are like have that same kind of like, I don't know what it is about me or like with the people that I end up surrounding myself with, but like there's always that same vibe everywhere I go, is like that. So I'm like, oh, indie musicians, that's the same. Like I'm just like, hey, same hat. So like essentially that kind of made it easier, and for me I was like yeah, duh, like absolutely, like that sounds like it would be like a really cool and interesting experience to have, and collaborating and stuff like that just sounds like a really enriching and just overall really like kind of actually pretty wholesome, like association to have. So yeah, that's my thoughts.
Yeah, I guess my feeling when we first got contacted about being involved in this was like, oh shit, there's something to do. People probably know that in music right now there's not much doing. Our primary practice of playing live has had the rug pulled on it, and I guess creatively our band exists as a collaborative project between three people who get together in a room and make stuff in the moment. That's our way of working, and we were sort of at that point a couple of months into an incredibly demoralizing process of recording bits at home on our own and sending them to each other. And
is that how your process ended up being, like this little weird layer?
That was what we attempted to do, and it was I don't think I've done anything that made me question my ability to work as a musician more in my life. And we were unable to meet up, unable to jam together, which is our thing. And we were, as I said, fruitlessly sending each other these very uninspired bits and going nowhere. And the prospect of getting to make something with someone, particularly a song that already existed, was incredibly exciting. I guess more speaking kind of like more to like where Cecile was going. Likewise, the world that we live in little punk bands in Melbourne is made up of people who are starting bands, playing in each other's bands, going and watching each other's bands. There's not that like traditional audience performer delineation, and so people sit on the merch desk at each other's shows and that kind of thing, and that it's actually like a participatory community necessarily before it's a professional or anything even remotely professional kind of sector, if you will. So the idea of being thrown in with someone who has a similar style of attitude to just see what happens is a pretty natural starting point for forming a band with people you know. So the idea of doing that with someone in a different art form was kind of exciting.
Yeah, and I'm sure that everyone in chat, all of these game developers, and shout out to Katie Stewart, who's also from VMDO and has been really involved in producing this project, are all nodding their heads and going, yeah, that's indie games too. Yeah, the entire time. It feels like just a massive network of mates sometimes, and sometimes just not even knowing where the audiences come from or how they find us, how they find our games. Yeah. So I know we're jumping around a little bit on our list of questions, but you mentioned that you're happy that it was a song that you'd already made. And for me, that brings us back to talking about sync music and the difference between having a composer and having, God, my cat is just really running around at the moment. Massive network of mates is a great term. Yeah, thanks, Ted. For me, there's sort of two things that come from that. One is, do you feel like the collaboration is different because you're not making new music? But two, on a purely producer production level, the thought of having to pay 3 people for music instead of just one composer who then pays session musicians, like it's a lot more expensive. So perhaps sync music is sort of good for us in that way. How do you think the collaboration has gone since you've already made the song?
Yeah, I feel like it's been a really nice feeling of like, here's something that you do, that you have done, that you did for whatever your original intentions and purposes were for it, and here's someone who actually sees another thing for that. I guess the like classic collaboration that's not dissimilar to this in music is the making of a video clip, when you send a song that's going to be a single to someone. And my hope is always that that they won't narrow the interpretation of that work when they form work around it. So the idea of a video clip that spells out what the lyrics of a song are in a literal fashion fills me with like an unease and a nausea about like, oh God, that'll be the defining voice of that work forever, when that was never its intention. It was meant to exist for others to take on and to work out what that means for themselves.
Wow.
The idea of an existing work being taken and used in the development of a video game, particularly at this point from the scratch point of development, not the idea of just, grabbing something to put on the car radio in Grand Theft Auto, is incredibly exciting, that someone would want to start with that piece of work and go, okay, where can we take this? What can this be a part of? Really, is an exciting thing.
Cecile, what are your thoughts on that?
I find it really, really funny for you, Nick, to be like, oh, like we can use something that we already made, because like that is very like, I think that I can relate to that in a way, because I'm like, yeah, like I think it also like makes it interesting for me, because I usually, when I make a game, I'll like have this idea in my head, and then I'll be like building it around that idea. And like this is this is that, but different, like in a way where like it's like, okay, we're gonna like choose a song, and we're gonna like analyze it, I guess, like look at it very closely with like different angles, and be like, okay, what can we make this about? Like, what story do we want to tell with both the song and the game? And like I find that so interesting, and like because it's not just a random song, but one that it's a collaboration between you who made it and me who has an outsider view of it, and that can only be interesting to me, like because it's that like especially because like the songs that we're like looking into right now are like quite personal to Jenny who wrote them, and I mean what I assume is personal to like to them, and like I'm just like, it's so different in that sense to me, because I'm like, usually like my game making process is quite lonely because I'm just like, I mean, it's not lonely, I'm fine with it, but like it's like, well, here I am again in front of my computer and I'm making this game, and like I'll try to like reach out to my peers and be like, hey, what do you think of this like script that I wrote, or like what do you think of this bit of the game that I'm struggling with? And like usually I'll try to seek out like collaboration anyway, so like having that like built into this project is good, because I'm like, I can just turn to someone and be like, what do you think? And I think that's always like the most exciting thing about making anything to me. So yeah, like I don't know if that like deviated from the question a little bit, or like but yeah, that's kind of like how I feel about the project as a whole, I think.
Yeah, I think Bonnie, you must be excited too, because this is not the usual sync music story, right? The fact that Cable Ties and Cecile are both in Victoria and in Melbourne has meant that the collaboration can be a little bit different to the usual sync process.
Absolutely. I think that's one of the things that, the way this project kind of developed, the fact that it turned into a collaboration on the game, I think is fantastic. Initially, we'd sort of talked about, and I know, Maize, we talked about just wanting this project in some ways to kind of demystify the idea of working with an indie band and working with source music, and the idea that it's not out of the realms of possibility at all. And in the same way that, when you're looking at syncing music onto tiny little indie films, there's always a way that you can make it happen. And it's not like, I guess that was sort of looking at how do we make that more possible so that this can happen more often. But the way that the project ended up developing into being a collaboration like this, I think is really exciting, because it's not that idea of, okay, here's a song, go for it, which funnily enough is kind of because of the lockdown, because originally it was going to be more like that. It was going to be more like, here's a song, and then there'll be developers, and then we'll do like a public thing somewhere, and it was going to be completely different. But even to your point, Maize, the fact that everyone is in Melbourne is almost irrelevant in some ways, because it's all going to happen, you know, it's all been happening online. But you're right, it is also, there's that kind of connecting of local communities and local people that I think is really hopefully something else that can kind of come out of this.
Yeah, definitely. We were talking about, like, you know, no one, when people think of sync music, they're like, oh yeah, I'd really like to license that Radiohead song into my thing. I can't afford them. Guess I'll pay a composer to make a rip-off version for cheaper, and I'll do that. And then, but being exposed to indie bands who are local is actually way more in fitting with how indie games are made. And so it's probably how we should think a little bit further around that. On collaboration, so on Tuesday, Cecile and Cable Ties and me, we got to working, and we used Miro, which was in the last panel as well. And I was a little bit worried that, you know, having to use this tech and not having the usual jam situation, you know, where we have those sorts of jams in games as well, would limit the creative juices. You know, it might like put a stopper in them a little bit, but it seemed to go fine and go really well. I guess everyone's an artist, so we all do sort of speak the same language already. Nick, how did you feel? Because I think you were talking about how your usual process is everyone getting in a room with your instruments and going. This is a little bit different.
Yeah. I really loved the opportunity to collaborate visually. So much of my work happens over not in so much in playing music, but in, I guess, you know, in music admin, booking, putting on events. The vast majority of it happens over phone and email. It's very like back and forth process of like this. And the idea of working in real time visually on a whiteboard was so exciting to watch other people's visual interpretations of what was going on as we all listened to a song at the same time and made notes and drew and made shapes and colors and highlighted bits and pieces. Was really great and really free form. I feel like outside of like playing, like making music in a band, you know, if instead of taking like the individual people as the collaboration, and you kind of look at the band as the atomic unit, like the most common collaboration that you do in a band is like playing at a festival, which is in which you've got like maybe like 4 or 5 production staff, maybe one of which you'll ever speak to, and you know, the festival kind of determines the parameters. They provide you with a stage of their choosing in a place that they like at a time that they want, and to give you a window of opportunity to cram your art into. And unless you're the very top of that bill, you have no say in how you can really present your work in that format. And this just felt like the complete opposite experience to that, of this freeform, real-time, communicative beginning process of like, well, how do we even start together? Which is pretty liberating.
Yeah, I do remember in the meeting before the actual collaboration started, there were a bit of how do we start? Yeah, Cecile, what did you think going in, and then what did you feel about that process on Tuesday, where we were all listening to the song together and writing notes together? To clarify, like we had the lyrics up, and you could see everyone going down.
Yeah, on the whiteboard. Yeah, that was really cool. I think like at first, like we got introduced to each other. It's kind of like, well, we don't know each other, and then it's like we try, like, you know, we talk about the project and we talk about each other and about ourselves, and like you know, kind of like we got to know each other through the first meeting, and then the second meeting was like, oh, now we're like all in the same space, like in, you know, like in the same kind of like plane that is the whiteboard, which is really funny. And like the funniest thing is that like pretty much all of us, except maybe you, Maize, like never heard of this thing before, and then we get like thrown onto it and we're like, okay, what do we do now? And like I feel like that kind of like being thrust into this, being thrust into that like like kind of environment where like we were all new to this thing, kind of like actually got us a little bit, you know, I don't know, like excited and be like, okay, we're gonna figure this out together. And like I feel like that really like made it, like it really helped, I think, and it was really fun to just kind of like squiggle lines and stuff. And like I was mostly just kind of like, I was really scared of like adding anything because I was like, I don't want to like you know, make a mistake or whatever. So I was just listening to the songs and like thinking, because that's what I do. And like yeah, no, it was really fun. Like honestly, that session was like really like eye-opening, and just kind of like having that kind of like banter, like it was really cool. Yeah, like that was really fun, and I'm really looking forward to more of this, like more of that kind of like stuff. And I think it really it kind of is very fitting to my kind of like working as well, because I overwhelmingly work on paper, like on writing down things, drawing things like on one piece of paper, and then being like, okay, this is how do I do this, like where does this go, and you know, like that sort of stuff like has always been like a very visual thing for me. So like having that like transposed to like the screen was very cool. And sharing that with other people too, like that was really cool.
Yeah. So I was just like, yeah, that was so good. How did you feel having to analyze music in that way?
Me, I'm like, I guess like I've always been a fan of music. Like, like I think like it's always been something interesting to me to kind of like reminded me of when I was a teen, and I'd like write down like, yeah, like Radiohead lyrics, whatever, and then like me and like a friend or whatever, we would look at it and we'd be like, oh my god, look at this, like this means this, you know, like that sort of like really. I wouldn't say entry level, but it's very exciting to kind of like look at something and be like, but what could this mean? You know, like, what does this mean to you? What does this mean to me? And like having this kind of like interpretation and kind of like imagining like a story from like these lyrics and the music and, you know, the mood that it creates and stuff. Like, I think that's always been something I enjoyed, honestly. Like even before this project, like I've always been like, you know, like inclined to, I don't know, listen to an album and kind of have these moods and be like, oh man, like, oh, and imagining like scenarios, and or like, you know, like, you know, I think it's pretty common to have like, you're feeling a certain mood, you're going to listen to this kind of song, and like this is kind of like that, but slightly different, where you have to also create something out of it. And I think like having this kind of like ties it back to the, you know, like using source music instead of like composing or like commissioning someone, you know, like question. I think like having source like an existing song kind of like helps with the process of like, what kind of tone are we going for, like what kind of mood, what kind of thing, because that's already kind of, you know, embedded in the song. So like I'm like, okay, this is a good base to, you know, like take the game idea from, and then like, I don't know, like because usually like it's really hard for me to be like, okay, I made this game, it's great, now I need to find music for it. And I'm just like goes. Yeah, like it's like, oh, hold on, what kind of mood, and like it's like it's hard. I'm just like I think I got really lucky in my past like few games where I could just literally just ask a friend like, hey, can I use this song that you made, or like, you know, like that sort of stuff. And yeah, that's been working well. But like I think it can be quite hard to find music for your little game. Like sometimes I think, yeah.
Nick, how do you feel about trying to engage in this co-design process with Cecile? When you think of like, what should a player be doing at this point in my song, or that sort of thing, how is that feeling for you?
I've found it to be to really freshen up my my ears in regards to our band's work. We've been looking through the process thus far. We've sort of looked at 3 different songs that we could potentially use, all of which are on our record that came out about 2.5 months ago. You can go and buy it from the Poison City web store right now if you're interested. It's excellent. But the
just popped a link in the chat.
Hell yeah.
Yeah. But the process of making a record involves listening to the same recording of your song 100 to 500 times and trying to find out what's wrong with it and what can be improved about it. And it ultimately decimates any enjoyment you want hearing what is meant to be your life's passion.
Yep.
And by the time you've gone through the process of writing, of rehearsing, of doing demos, of moving towards recording, and then going through a period of having a song mixed multiple times and then mastered, put onto a test pressing record, which gets sent to you for approval, like there is nothing in there for you anymore. It is that moment when you sign off on that test pressing is a moment of sheer relief that you don't have to think about your shortcomings again for a bit. And and the idea of ever hearing it again has no appeal. And this process of sitting down like in front of your computer with 4 or 5 other people listening to one of your songs at the same time to make something of it, to ask yourself, like, what's actually going on here? What does this mean? What does this feel like? Is totally different to looking at, like, you know, distortion in the treble frequency of the moment of a test pressing because the record's been cut too hot in a lathe in, you know, in Europe somewhere. It's like I actually got to go, this work is actually all right. Like, there's something here. And I know I've only kind of talked to my own work here, but it's seriously just like opened up this thing of like, oh wow, yeah, we did actually put a whole lot of emotion and narrative and ideas into this, none of which were specifically technical in their origin. And it's about reclaiming those emotions and those passions and that purpose in your work. So it's been great. Thanks, VMDO.
Yeah,
Bringing me back from the brink.
That is so amazing. It's so wonderful, especially in this crazy time. But I think that was one of the things I saw, and I just can't remember her name, but I saw this great speaker at in London last year at the AIM Sync conference. She was talking about the work that she did as a composer on games and how she had started by basically being given a fully formed game and you know, like you said, Cecile, kind of at that point, you know, okay, cool, put the music on it, try to retrofit whatever was supposed to be happening in the game with the music that you're composing right now. And she said little by little, as she worked on more of these games, she started coming in earlier and earlier and earlier, so that, you know, the two parts would feed off each other, and you know, what was possible in terms of that mood or whatever was being created in the music or the game could be reflected and enhanced during the process of making. So it's really interesting to think about that from the perspective then of, you know, like you said, starting with a fully formed song, but how that then impacts from that being the starting point as opposed to the fully formed game being the starting point. And, you know, I think that was kind of the idea of this project too, was, does this work? Is this a good idea? If it isn't, that's okay. You know, it's like, what are the various different ways that music and games can work together? And let's not just presume that it's about getting a composer to come on at the end and put some music on, you know, over the top of what's happening, but actually, yeah, where does it make sense to collaborate and to involve music and to include music? And this is way more beautiful than I ever dreamed.
Yeah, there's definitely, like, my career is in just plain game audio, and that is how most careers sort of go in game audio, is that you get used to, I'm always at the end, and, you know, sort of similar to film as well. Composers get the last week and complain about never getting a locked off film. People keep changing it and they have to keep changing. And then, you know, in the last few years, I am pretty much always there right at the start of production, and I just don't sign contracts that don't have me on until the end, because I know that they suck. Like, it just sucks to work on that. Yeah, I think something that's been really cool is how well Cecile and Cable Ties have matched. And we talked about that process a little bit, or a fair amount actually, Bonnie, and with Katie as well, is like, who do we match together and how do we match them together? What if it doesn't work? You know, what are your thoughts on that? Like,
first of all, can I just say hats off to Maize, because you had a really clear idea of how it could work, and it turned out that it did work. So yeah, well done.
Thanks.
Yay.
Yeah.
Well, originally we had an idea, it was kind of pretty chicken and eggish, because we sort of had this idea that it was going to be this sort of match-up thing. And then we thought, well, we can't just randomly, we were going to start with a bigger project, and then we decided to try one first. And then if it works, we'll try, you know, we'll see whether we can do it again and include some more people. But we thought, let's just start with one. And then initially, when it was going to be the bigger project, we were going to do kind of expressions of interest on both sides. And then we hadn't quite got to that, like, what, just randomly pick people and put them together. And then we thought, well, actually, you're going to have to pick one side to kind of start where, and it sort of made sense that, given that the works would already be created, that actually starting with the developer and then saying, is there anyone that you might want to work with? And then we'll try to sort of do it in that way. But it was still very much, you know, we were just feeling our way in terms of how do you know what will work? But then Maize just figured it out.
I did push back a fair few times, which I think the local games industry is probably quite sick of me pushing back on things constantly. But hey, look at this, it's happening.
And this was part of it too, was this idea that, you know, also now that you two have both been, or, you know, Cable Ties and Cecile have been through the process, then actually the process will only get easier, because there are people to talk to who'll be able to say, well, I know this band, I think they'd be well suited to this project, this kind of project, or I know this developer, you know, and so it can kind of develop on its own a little bit. But in the first place, yeah, it was just kind of who are some really nice humans who might get along, and yeah,
and have similar aesthetics. Also, you know, who we think have a similar attitude in their process. But I think, Bonnie, you are also very much a champion of, well, if it gets people talking, if it gets Cecile and Cable Ties talking, even if they argue, we'll learn something from it, you know.
I hope we don't argue.
Specifically.
I can't imagine you two ever arguing, I have to say.
It's just about, like, devs and musicians. If any of these relationships that we try and foster don't work, we'll still be learning something from it.
Yeah.
We'll still be...
Yeah, it was kind of a no-lose situation, because we currently have no idea if something like this could work. So either it can or it can't, or maybe we need to tweak something. But yeah, and that's been kind of the process too. And that's when I said before about demystifying, like, it just, the conversation that Maize and I had really early on was just like, there are two silos and they're not connected at all. And so anything we can do to connect them in any way just felt like it was worth a shot.
Yeah. And, you know, we made a huge list of games that have used indie musicians and looked at some of their processes also, and like, you know, which came first, and, you know, how many different tracks. You know, there's some great examples of games that have used a lot of source music, but next to nothing here. Like, couldn't really find it much here. And, you know, part of that is also like the age, I suppose, of indie games here, and how that's changed. But also, yeah, I think when you said demystifying, that is a part of it. So like, what are some of the legal things? I mean, we usually, for a games composer, you get paid a flat rate, and then you hope, you try really hard to negotiate for some royalties on top, which is a little bit different to usual music licensing in advertising or in film or that sort of thing. What sort of conversations were you having with the media arts lawyers, Bonnie?
I mean, I guess there's kind of horses for courses across any number of ways of licensing music. So, and that was kind of the initial conversations that I'd had with a few people on the game side. Seemed like there was a feeling like there was kind of one way to do it, and that if that didn't really work, then you kind of couldn't do it. And that was, you know, one of the conversations we'd had, Maize, was about that kind of being the they're just kind of being that feeling. And instead, when I went to speak to media arts lawyers, I wanted to see whether there was a way that there could be some flexibility, so that if we put something together, it wasn't like, oh, good, now there's two ways of doing it, but actually it's just a negotiation. So, you know, it's going to depend on any number of things. And part of that is, you know, I think the kind of contract that we drew up is kind of a framework that could be used in other contexts and in other ways. And this has obviously got a bit of a intermediary, because the VMDO is in there saying, well, we'll contribute some funding on either side that wouldn't normally be there. But it was to kind of just a proof of concept, I guess, to say, well, you know, you can license a track that you retain the rights in, but it's actually pretty straightforward, because it happens in film and in advertising and a range of things, but how you would do that would depend on what the deal was. So, you know, I guess that's the thing, that you could, if you you know, you can do exclusives on things if there's a situation that makes that warranted, and if you agree with that, or you can do things where you know, you have it for a period of time and then there's a rollover. And we had to think about those things too, that obviously, you know, if this is a game that's going to exist out into the world, then having something like that is probably not going to be that useful, because it'll still exist somewhere. So we had to do something that would include, you know, a license for perpetuity, but not necessarily something that in any way going to restrict Cable Ties from doing whatever they want to do with their song. And that was kind of also, I guess, a reflection of the fact that seeing games music starting to, and I'm sorry if there's a better name for that, that's what people in the music side call it, but it's probably called something else in real life. But seeing that, you know, like playlists and releases of music that is featured in games kind of taking on more of a life of its own outside of games. Also, I think it seemed like there'd be value then in exploring this idea of music that already has a life outside of the game to be in it, you know, that it's not that different in some ways, that actually looking for ways of licensing music so that it can exist in two places and have kind of different, you know, monetized back in different ways is probably helpful, hopefully.
Yeah, helpful for everyone. Yeah, this sort of brings me to, we have a question. Can you tell us about the financial side of how this works? Is there funding as part of the VMDO initiative, which you hinted at that, yeah, VMDO is helping this round as part of trying to foster these two communities to come together, right?
And also because it's an unknown. So there's some funding on either side for Cecile and for cable ties, and then really that's to kind of, I guess, mitigate the risk of involvement for both parties. And it'll be interesting to see after that whether this is something that could happen without that funding. Is there another way, what it looks like afterwards? So it's really about saying we don't want anyone to lose out by being part of this, and we can't promise what it's going to look like at the end. So we'll just cover that to make sure that your time is covered and or hopefully, and then at the end of it we can look at it and say, well, is this something that you could do in the future without intervention, and if not, what would need to change in order for that to actually work, so that we're not kind of creating something that can't be replicated in the real world without the VMDO's involvement, because that would be pointless.
Yeah.
Although it sounds like it would still have been a fun thing to do.
Yeah, definitely. But that trying to get, I guess during COVID, it would be a convenient time. But at any other time, I suppose, Nick, your band would have other things to do, I suppose.
Yeah, we had our busiest year ever planned this year. We were
damn it.
We were 48 hours away from getting on a flight to LA in March, when we had to make the call not to go when the South by Southwest Music Conference was cancelled.
Oh, that's fucked. Sorry.
Oh, we had the same thing, right? South by Southwest
Yeah.
is a week before GDC. So,
Mm.
and a lot of games people will go to both as well.
Yeah. And there are games at South by Southwest. Like I know a friend who their work was supposed to be like, their like game that they worked on was supposed to be featured, and then like it was cancelled, and I'm like, oh, like it was just like absolutely devastating. Annoying.
Yeah.
I mean, we were looking at between the middle of March and the middle of June, we were going to have a weekend off.
Just a weekend.
Last night, I got to the end of all 6 seasons of Lost last night.
I love Lost. It's so good.
Hey, Nick.
Yeah, that brings me to a couple of things. I'll go with this question first. So how important is time during this process? Like, because I remember right at the start when we were like, let's have a game ready for Freeplay, and Cecile was like, yeah, all right, I'll bust out a game. It's a bit different now because we've said, all right, you'll have until the end of July. And even on Tuesday, we left it after an hour. One, because we're a bit like tired. There was a lot of brain stuff. But two, because we have the time. What's sort of different about this? And, do you enjoy having this more time? Is it necessary?
For me, up until now, I've always had this kind of like, every time I made a game, I would just make it really quick, like really under pressure, and it's honestly not really a healthy thing to do. I would not recommend it. It's just that it's like one of these things where I'm like, okay, so the thing is that because I work alone, I find it hard to motivate myself to like really like get into like, work, like if there's no like sense of urgency, which honestly sucks. No one should do this, but I do it because, and like I think this is different because like not only we have more time, but also like we can hold each other accountable, and like it's actually kind of like a better attitude to have than like me being like, oh, okay, I need to work, I can't go outside for like two weeks, and then like like instead it's like a lot more like lax, and it actually gives us time to kind of like we work our brains hard for like an hour, and then we're like, okay, we're gonna take a break and let the background brain do like, take care of this. And like, and I feel like that leads to different results, because it's like, it's got that like, where that inspiration strikes in a different way, where like, instead of like forcing yourself to kind of like be like, okay, what's a good idea, like instead you're like, oh, maybe this could be good, like, and having that, like, it's a little bit better, like it's just different, but like I think it's it lends itself better for collaboration, I think. Yeah. That's kind of like how I feel. But yeah, like I think this is I like having a little bit more like confidence in what we can do within the scope of time. Like it's like, okay, well, we can actually think about this and rationally instead of scrambling. Yeah, like that's kind of like how I feel. And yeah, like getting a game ready for Freeplay was it was hard. Like it would have been a bad idea. Because like I was working on this whole thing, so I'm like, anyway, yeah, that's kind of like how I felt. Yeah, how I feel about like all this. Yeah, it's good.
Yeah, I feel pretty similarly. If we were trying to get something ready for this weekend, Cecile would have just done the work, like, because we don't know how to make a video game, and we already did a song, so like it would have been like, well, there's. I know Cecile had kind of talked about the idea of being capable of making a video game in, a very, very short period of time. But I'm just a massive believer in the creative process of downtime as an essential ingredient. I mean, our band's work rate is or production rate is just the opposite of linear. We can, when working on new stuff, spend hours and, like days and days and make no progress on anything. And then to kind of come back and find a week later that it's all there, and that it was all very obvious to a fresh set of eyes. And I feel like that, having time away to actually I liked that background brain description that you used, Cecile, of that things can actually tick away while you're getting on with other stuff in your life, to kind of return with thoughts and ideas, and also just allowing you to be kind of come familiar with each other's work styles and ways of doing things. I reckon it's a pretty essential ingredient in something like this.
Yeah, when you spoke about like, oh, I guess Cecile would just do all the work and just make a game because we made a song. When you played through Cecile's games in preparation to just sort of get the aesthetic, but also think about like what games can do, what sort of thoughts ran through your head playing Cecile's games?
Oh, I was just really taken by the storytelling elements that were, that just unraveled slowly, and really just, I don't know, felt like she was, that they were in a really small kind of game, developing so much mood and emotion and feeling in them. And I feel like I guess I was really drawn to the kind of lo-fi graphic nature of them, as well as being like a limiting palette on composing, something which I really like. We're similarly as a three-piece band who do things in a somewhat like minimalist composing fashion. I really liked how much was there from so many from like a simple component set, and immediately was like, yeah, this is this is a creative force that I feel that we can kind of meet and understand with.
Yeah, so you could relate it to how you work straight away.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. Are you much of a gamer already?
I have kind of got back into playing games in the last couple of years, having probably not played them much over the last decade. I feel like a housemate getting a Nintendo Switch and getting to wander endlessly in Zelda's Breath of the Wild was a real way back. And I'm mates with Jake, who's part of the crew that did Untitled Goose Game,
Yay.
which was something that got our house very excited. In the last couple of years have rekindled that enjoyment of playing games.
Yeah. Was it something that you were connecting to your music already, or was it just like that's separate?
Yeah, no. I had I don't know. I've just always before this working on this, I've always seen our practices like us as kind of Luddites. We're like a very analog, very personally very obsessed with a certain production aesthetic from the 70s and a way of making and doing that I'm kind of a bit rusted onto, and sort of saw video games as being like far more sophisticated and complex than the sort of things that I could make a contribution towards in any way. Yeah.
Cecilia nodding a lot.
Because I just really like that description as being an analog person, because I feel that even as someone who makes games, I feel like Bitsy falls into that analog category in a weird way. It's because it's so simple, and you can tack mods on like hacks on if you wanna, but you can also not, and it's that kind of it's like a modular synth. It's having that weird thing that you're trying to figure out as you work with it, and and the fact that it's so accessible, so kind of makes it it's kind of having pen and paper and then just making a game with that. I really like that, and I think more and more it's just of course I think Maize, you did an amazing job kind of just bringing us together and stuff, because I think it's not just because of a musical it's not because of the sound of the music, and but it's more about the vibe that we both or all have, and I think it's just such a good, interesting thing to it doesn't surprise me that much that people in different artistic fields would have similar worldviews and ways of work ethics, but it is always nice to kind of bring people together and see how it goes, and I think it's kind of like hanging out with two friends of different friend groups and being okay, are they gonna get along, or are they gonna hate each other, and then they meet up and we all hang out, and it's actually it's going great, and it's oh god, thank god thank god I have good friends. It's kind of how it feels. I don't know if this makes sense, but that's kind of my feelings about it, just this really cool. That's why I've been nodding a lot this entire session.
I think what's really so cool about that is that this was that conversation that we had, Maize. It was about the fact that Cecile, to your analogy, being about to introduce people and thinking and saying, I'm excited because I think they're really going to like each other. That idea too, that there's also not just you two, but there's when Nick said before about within the bands that you kind of are in your orbit and that you go see and they go see you, and there is actually I feel like there's potential here for more collaborations and for more, just more and more whatever comes of it. But it feels kind of pretty unlikely that would be nothing.
I definitely want to see what it's like if, is there hip hop games, where the process is really sort of hip hop,
That'd be so cool.
because we've definitely got like, this grunge indie process down, but I suppose actually the genres aren't defined by their process. I think maybe
No, I mean, I think that that was what we originally thought about, was could we do a big project where there's lots of different kind of ways of working and we try and pair everyone up, and then that just after a while felt like that might be a bridge too far, and let's just try to walk before we run. But I think it is exciting to think about just, even the fact that, like with any kind of communities, there's going to be people who click and there's people who won't, but it is, to go back to what I guess we keep on saying, is it's really just about opening the door and saying, you're all there, maybe see if something happens and see if you want to work together. Because I think it just seems like there's opportunities for music and games that are more than just a soundtrack.
Yeah, fully. Yeah. And that sort of question in chat saying that Cecile's game is using an existing cable tie song. Did anything need to change to make it suitable to be used as a video game, or was the game built around the song as it was? And it's something that we've sort of touched on a little bit, is like, should we chop the song up into parts? Should we make it loop and stuff like that? And I guess there's a few technical things that make that a little bit hard, because it's pre-recorded, it's not MIDI. It makes it a little harder to get loops happening. But what are your feelings, Cecile and Nick, on that? Like, I get the feeling that actually neither of you are sort of keen on that chopping it up and trying to have different sections.
It's like one part of it is because like I find it very awkward, like difficult with Bitsy in particular. I'm sure like other like more complicated game engines like make it easy for like things to kind of like fade in and out of each other, but with Bitsy it's a little bit harder, and I don't think I have the skills, like the coding skills, to like actually make that happen without someone's help. But like which is why I'm more thinking about like just using the track as it is and kind of like building a narrative like around it, and like hoping that the player won't go too fast. Like when like playing the game, like, no, don't speed run it, like, like that sort of thing where like you can't speed run the song, like like I feel like it would be interesting to kind of like find the perfect balance between, like making the player, like controlling the player's pace while the song goes on. Like I feel like it's like a very much a game of balance. I feel like an example where I don't use a loop is my game Novena. And that was a track that I used from my friend Mira at Brambles. And it's like a 6-minute track. It's long enough that people don't really notice that it's like just one song, but it is one song. And I'm just like, I was really fortunate to have that song track because it's instrumental, like fit the mood of the game so well that like the timing was pretty much matching the emotional beats of the game, and like that was really cool. And I'm like, okay, I managed to make it happen once, I can probably like manage to make it happen twice. That's kind of like how I'm feeling about it. I'm like, I don't really want to chop it and like butcher, like I don't really want to like Frankenstein it, because I don't know, it feels like there is so much tension / mood that comes with the song as it is, that it would be it would be like a little bit like too bad to just kind of like chop it for the game. Does that make sense? Like I just kind of like feel like it is a good like limit, like restraint to have this like, okay, we have to make this happen within the song. Like I don't know if that makes sense. Yeah.
It sounds like a lot of interesting design problems. Like how do you get the player to how do you get their pace basically to match, what you want? How do you encourage the player to move and feel in the way that you want them to?
Yeah, and it's like I think I've talked about this like in like a previous conversation, like in private, where like so much of like pacing control and stuff, like for me, like it's something that I've learned like making comics and zines and stuff, like where you like turn a page, and when you like turning the page is part of the pacing, and like you can control that, like the book itself, the like the physical aspect of a book with pages you can't change, but you can change how the player turns the pages, if that makes sense. And like it is very much the same to me with games in Bitsy, where like you can slow down or make it faster, like depending on like what the player can interact with, and like it's very much like that weird fine-tuning thing of not the like engine itself, but what the engine presents as tools. I don't know if this is worded well. Anyway, that's yeah.
Nick, how do you think about leading listeners? And maybe also an interesting question is it different between when you're thinking about the listener listening to your album and when you're thinking about them live and dancing?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I was just going to start by saying that I'm not too precious about the song, Cecile. So do
okay.
do feel free to some degree to hack it to bits and do your thing. For the purpose of this, we've actually sent Cecile the instrumental masters as well as the release masters of the record. So which is something that you primarily have instrumental masters produced for syncs for film and TV, because likewise they they want to be able to control where your song hits in a particular moment. They want to be able to drop the lyrics while the characters are talking, and then they want to be able to bring them in. And our most of our music is kind of centered around repetition in playing, and that is the jam format that it writes from. So we, like, when we make music for ourselves, the vast majority of the music that we make starts as a single small component that somebody brings in, and they play for half an hour to everyone else, and everybody, the other two members of the band, join in and they jam around it. If you can't play an idea for 30 minutes without stopping, what makes you think you're going to want to play it for 2 fucking years? Like you're going to have to get up at every show and play that. So you may as well love the components is one of my artistic principles, that before you worry too much about verse and chorus, before you worry too much about harmony and how all these things fit together, like, are you actually in love with this little bit? Because you're going to play it a lot. And that's why the idea of handing over the instrumental masters for someone to set up loops on is like something that feels very natural to me, because I'm just like, oh no, like, let's just run through the chord changes for another 32 bars. That's a piece of piss, like as a jamming or a rehearsal thing. And likewise, when after you kind of go through that, I've kind of already talked about that painful funneling process of making a record, of getting it to that point, is like, as soon as we signed off on that record, it was like, great, like, let's reimagine those songs as live pieces, because fuck, if I'm gonna play that
That thing again.
Well,
if I like
okay.
that again, it's like it's a different purpose, and that stretching things out, and leaning into repetition and riff worship is one of my favorite practices. So I think that idea, and that's about, particularly with our band, it's like it's a really, really loud band with big amps. Simple repetitious music is actually about engaging like with the physicality of sound with the audience, and that holding people in place, or engaging with their bodies through movement is like a primary driver for us. So that idea of thinking about, and we're also just big fans of putting two things that don't necessarily sound like natural progressions next to each other, which I feel is that idea of movements, and that naturally relates to pacing and storytelling in some fashion.
Yeah.
Well, in that case, no, like I think that's really cool. Like that's a really good insight, because like I think I tend to be very polite when it comes to like, oh, hold on, I can't, like, and also because maybe it's also on me, like, because I may not have like full confidence on my like ability to like chop music or whatever, like, like, and that sort of stuff. But I think that's a very like enlightening like thing to say, because like I can understand that. Like I feel like sometimes I'll like play test my games, right, and I'll be like, okay, now I get it, okay, and then like it's kind of like you kind of get in on that lull where it's like, I don't know if what I'm doing, like, if I don't know if this is good anymore, and like once it's released. But like I feel like, yeah, like kind of making that remix gives it that freshness, I guess. And I think that could be an interesting element to add to the game.
Yeah,
that's kind of how I feel. Like I'm like, you know what, you've changed my mind.
yeah. We're
so,
still
yeah.
in it. We're still in this.
Yeah, we're still.
Process.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
That sounds really cool. I'll keep it in mind. And
it's also really great to kind of see this conversation play out, and I think for Maize and I to kind of just realize, okay, in the next incarnation of this program, it would be good to ask some questions up front that maybe, like, are you cool for your song to be changed, or like not make assumptions about that, but just help facilitate some conversations that might completely change the way that things sort of happen, just because it is new and there isn't like a standard of what you should or shouldn't do.
Yeah, absolutely. Chad in the chat asks, is there any interest in the indie music band scene to collaborate with game makers? And I just like, this is the indie music band scene reaching out to us, Chad. Yes, there is interest. Yeah. They started this, Chad. But yeah, I think that relates to a question that I think pertains to our audience a lot is, the way that we find other indie games is, we have Itch, which is like the Bandcamp of games, and we have conferences, just so many conferences, and then otherwise, like, there's Twitter, and award shows and things like that, and that tends to be how we find like the next exciting games, and it's usually a network of mates, as I said earlier, and that's how we find them. How would we go and find indie bands? Like, it's not still DJs and radio, is it? Or is it like, do we go to venues? How do you find indie bands? Like, how do you consume music now? Outside of the Spotify radio, like, does that help us find local indie bands?
I mean, I'm probably not a typical music consumer, but I'm a big community radio person. My background is in listening to community radio and volunteering and broadcasting there. And for me, if you're looking to engage with the what's going on in the city that you're living in, you really can't do a lot better than listening to PBS, Triple R, 3CR, particularly if you're looking for people to collaborate with, because if if you sort of take that kind of like outsider status that I'm not in that music world, and you're the music that has like licensing fees in the thousands and tens of thousands of dollars, that's not a very approachable, but those groups aren't necessarily going to be approachable to work on little projects like a 5 or 7 minute game. But flicking onto a show like Local and or General on Triple R or Homebrew on PBS is an opportunity to hear brand new music being made by people who don't even necessarily have a record label, or their record label is run out of someone's bedroom. And that's, I know we were talking just before we jumped on air about like where our conferences happen. And my conferences happen between 1 and 3 a.m. at music venues after the bands finish. And what goes on there is discussion, conversation, meeting, and connecting with people without an agenda. And that all of the, well, just about all this, I would say all of the strongest working relationships that I have in music have come out of meeting people in a more social environment and being genuinely interested in what they do, and vice versa, and feeling that connection as a starting point between two people before the prospect of like, hey, I run a label, or hey, I play in a band and we should do something together comes along. It actually first comes from like, did you see that person play tonight? Wasn't that great? Like, sorry, that was a very long-winded answer to it.
No, I love it.
No, it's good.
There's lots of love for Triple R in the chat as well. Shout out to Bite, Wednesday night, 7 p.m. Lots of love between Bite and Freeplay as a co-host. We do love Triple R.
Can I just say that I really miss gigs? I really miss going to gigs. I'm like, where are they now? It's like, like all these things that I used to be really excited about, like, are now gone, and I'm like, I just want to like listen to live music. I keep talking about it with all my friends. I'm like, I remember gigs, and like it's something I really miss. And like even just as a listener, right? Like as part of the audience, I really miss that. So like, can't imagine like how even worse like musicians must feel. Like I just can't wait for that to be back, honestly.
Especially the Cable Ties sound is so
I'm so excited. Like whenever that comes back, I'll be like, it's gonna be so good.
We were just listening to the same song at the same time. Sorry, go ahead, Bonnie.
I think that's one of the other reasons why we felt like it was important to just introduce people and then kind of get out of the way, because I think anytime, like seeing that we saw there's an opportunity to kind of connect people, but the idea of doing some sort of networking event and having a room where all the games developers are on one side and the music people are on the other, and you kind of have to try to lure people across, like it just feels like that is just not going to work. So I think if we, if there are ways that make sense to kind of host things or get people together, or if it's just a case of maybe we just need to, put a little star on some gigs and say, we'll make sure a bunch of people will be at these ones or something. I don't know. And like to Nick's point, kind of, not necessarily thinking about what it might be, but just having a conversation and seeing what comes from there is sort of, I guess, the idea behind this whole project.
Yeah. And definitely, like, we talk about the Freeplay community a lot in Melbourne, and, there is a community radio community. It's in the name, and a network of a lot of people who all, you know, turn up to similar places, you know, just like in games. So it's a similar once you're in these sorts of places you're in. Duncan says, would you consider selling games like this along with band merch at live gigs? Nick, would you?
Yes. Is the short answer? I mean,
would it be on a USB? Or I got a USB at a regurgitator gig once in a badge. That was cool.
yeah. I mean, one thing that people sometimes do now that you know, doing a physical release of music is a bit more costly. A lot of artists, you know, sometimes their first release will be a t-shirt with a download code like pinned to it, and you know, you buy a band t-shirt and it comes with a band's EP on it, and you know, can't see any reason why somebody wouldn't say, yeah, I'll buy a piece of cardboard that,
or a t-shirt.
Yeah, or a t-shirt, absolutely. But you know, a something that comes with a video game. I say absolutely. Cecile?
Honestly, like, yeah, that sounds really cool. Like, I mean, like, honestly, like the type of games that I make, like, up until now have always been like free to play because it's my hobby. Like, I just kind of like, I never like imagined selling like the bitsy games that I made. I'm just like, I always had this idea of like, oh yeah, like it's just something I make for fun. But I feel like, yeah, like totally, like I think having like, it's kind of like, yeah, like selling a zine, selling a little piece, like a piece of merch, right? Like a badge or whatever, like that kind, it would be like that kind of like vibe, I think. Like that's kind of like, and it kind of reminds me also of those free demo of games that came with cereal boxes back in the, like, you know, in the old years. Yeah, like so that's kind of like what everyone's been. So I'm like, yeah, okay, that sounds good. That's kind of how I feel about it.
Yeah. You even mentioned, I mean, so Bandcamp is similar to Itch in that you can put any files up there to download. But Bitsy is, you can just HTML embed it in. Haven't tried that yet, to try and embed it on Bandcamp. That's a fun way of doing it as well. Bonnie, we did discuss having the games at the gigs also. How do you think about that, Nick? Like, you know, where sort of warehouse parties and also conferences tend to have, like, you know, heaps of music and then some games and stuff set up, or at least these new games warehouse parties that have been happening the last few years. Would you be weirded out by an audience member playing a game while you're playing music on stage? Or, you know, what are some ways that we can think about getting those two interactions in the same space?
Yeah, that's definitely one worth giving some deeper thought to, I reckon. I mean, I'm not under any illusions that when my band plays, everyone who has paid to get in or everyone who's in the venue is watching us. It's like, people are going to the bar, people are going out for a cigarette, people are having a conversation up the back, people are deciding that, like, this isn't that hot, like, let's go to the front bar and actually enjoy ourselves for a bit. Like, the idea of there being you know, something else going on in the room is fine, and I don't think it's something that people need to be afraid is sucking the oxygen out of the room or somehow putting themselves in competition with another art form.
Yeah. I personally think it's amazing and would be great, because whenever games are shown at warehouse parties or at conferences or whatever, unless the player puts on headphones, they don't hear the music in the game. But if the band is up there, then sweet, done.
I'm just thinking, like, how cool would it be to have like this whatever song that we choose, you start playing it, and before you start playing it, you ask someone from the audience to play the game, and it would be like blown up on like a screen behind you, and like as they play, you play the thing. That would be so cool, actually. What the hell?
Yeah.
Like that would be such a cool like experimental thing. I don't know if like it could, you know, the logistics of it, like I'm not thinking about that because it's like a dream, but like that would be cool.
Well,
like
yeah, Bonnie and I, well, we were all just discussing off air before we went live on here about the possibilities of live music with without mass gatherings allowed, and the idea of the band playing 7-minute sets of one song for one person at a time to play a video game alongside. I've already got a venue in my mind that this would work at, and
Great.
yeah, I think there's great potential to at least try and make something like that happen.
That would be good. Like
so cool.
the venue has a front bar so that everyone who's not playing, and then you pay your
Yeah.
$10 to go in and play the 7-minute game, and you're not sick of your songs at all, so that'll be fine.
I might have laid that on a bit thick to be stepping back from it now.
I love it.
I think that's the thing, that it's just like, it's kind of, the possibilities are endless, and it would be another one where it'll be dependent on the band and the show and so many things, but there is now this there will be this beautiful thing that can be incorporated in some way into the world of the band. And whether that's, as Nick said before, like the example of the film clip, like maybe this is the film clip for your new song or something, like it could be any number of ways that people can engage with that. And it might also be like it'll live on its own with no connection to the band, but people will find their way back to the band from playing it, and yeah.
Yeah, it actually reminds me of when I was a student and researching the history of game audio. Some of the first game audio was in the penny arcades, and the way that these companies who made these penny arcades would get around gambling laws was saying, "Oh no, you're just putting the money in to listen to the song. There's nothing nefarious. It's just the song."
Wow.
So 7 minutes of 7 in heaven, done. All right, so we've got just a few minutes left, and yeah, in chat there's a few examples of, yes, there's been live games played with live music. 7-Bit Hero do this. I think that also Tim Shield with Duet did this at some point. And there are a fair few game dev DJs around here who also use games as their visuals as well. So yeah, very cool. But this 7-minute idea, I haven't heard this one yet. Any closing remarks?
Just go for it, Nick.
No, I just wanted to say thanks to you, Maize, and Bonnie and Katie at the VMDO for asking us to be part of a pilot program like this, for the if nothing else, for the very exploratory nature of it. And thus far the experience has also been a wonderful one.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I want to echo that as well. Like I'm super excited for like this project, and like it's been like a delight to like have this kind of like fun little experiment that we get to do, and it's just like, I don't know, I'm just really happy about it, and I'm super excited to like really like delve into it like really deep, and yeah, I think it's gonna be awesome.
That's great. Hopefully it's the first of many, and yeah, just I'm excited about obviously playing this game at some point, but also into seeing what comes next, and whether there are some more collaborations and more ways of working together with and I think, Maize, you said early on, like, just feels like in Melbourne there's such an amazing there's so many amazing game developers in the indie scene and so many amazing bands in the indie scene, and the idea that they could do something together just seemed really obvious. So I'm so happy that it's gonna kind of happen.
Yeah. Huge shout out to Katie and Bonnie, who've been in touch with Cable Ties this entire time. I was also sort of racking my brain a bit of like, I don't know who. So yeah, it's been lovely. I think we'll have a great time, and I do wish that we had a VMDO of indie games who had a lot of these sort of little experimental initiatives. Maybe film.
That's okay. Just send any other ones that you have, as long as they include music. Send them over, and we'll
Great.
see what we can do.
All right. Well, thanks so much. We'll say goodbye to everyone on stream. That was wonderful. And Ben, thank you for dealing with our stream on the silent Zoom participant.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Bye.